Hey everybody, welcome back to another edition of Horror by the Book with Noel Wing. Today we're going to talk about Mr. Edgar Allan Poe. Sorry I've been gone so long, I'll explain why when we start the segment. So, let's get going. Cue it! Cue it! You just can't get good help these days. So we're back, and I've been gone for a bit. Haven't been too active in this channel, but it's starting to pick up again. I've been gone because I decided to write another story. This is The Flight. It's a novel. It's out on Amazon, or you can go to noelwing.com and find it. The Flight is a story about an airplane that crashes, and the aftermath is worse than the crash, and people are going to start perishing. So you better read it. It's a cross of horror and parallel universe type of stuff, so I hope you give it a look and enjoy it. But today, we are talking about Mr. Edgar Allan Poe, the founding father of today's modern detective story, short story. He had quite an influence, I think, on American writers. Certainly an amazing talent. A very creative person. Very troubled. You can look back at his life on the internet, find out oodles and oodles of information on Edgar Allan Poe. So I'm not going to cover that. I'm just going to talk about a few of his favorite short stories. At least my favorite short stories. I'm not sure if they're his favorite. I haven't really asked him. Anyway, let's get going. Let's talk about the one that I thought would be the best movie. And it was made into a movie once, kind of a B-level movie, I thought. The Fall of the House of Usher. It's a story about a man named Roderick Usher and his sister Madeline. And Roderick is writing letters to this person, the narrator of the story. Another story written in first person, by the way, which isn't always so easy. We'll talk about that a little bit later. So the narrator visits Roderick Usher per Roderick's invitation and finds that his friend Roderick is having lots of issues, mental issues. There's weird stuff going on in the house, weird stuff with his sister. The thing about The Fall of the House of Usher is how well he describes the detail in it. Poe really gets into the detail of the way the house looks, the way his friend Roderick looks. I think it's his most detailed story as far as trying to put you there right in the house with him. And it's a pretty dark story. It's supernatural. There's some dark stuff in there, no doubt about it. I would consider that horror, to me. But I'm not sure if there's a ton of symbolism in it, as much as it just is a good, flat-out, scary, weird story. So, The Fall of the House of Usher, I thought was probably my favorite story that he wrote. I just thought it flowed good for 1840s English, by the way, which isn't always so easy to read either compared to today's English. It's just different. Maybe people who are alive in 1840 would think today's English is impossible to read. I don't know. But I can tell you that it can get cumbersome reading some of that. So anyway, The Fall of the House of Usher, one of my favorites by Poe, no doubt. Let's go on to the next one called Pit and the Pendulum. This has to do with the Spanish Inquisition, a guy that's kind of put in a basement type enclosure. He runs around in there a little bit and wanders around, finally gets tied up, and there's a blade above him swinging, and he's getting ready to get sliced open, and he uses rats to get his ligatures undone, which was really pretty clever the way he pulled that off. And it's a great use of rodents. I mean, who doesn't want a rodent that'll get you untied from a bad situation? But a lot of historians say that it's not a very good representation of what the Inquisition was about, which is probably true. I doubt Poe really cared about that. He was just writing a good scary story. That was made into a movie, I think in the 60s, with Vincent Price in it. Once again, not a great film, not a high-budget film. But Pit and the Pendulum's a good read. Let's go on to the next one I think has heavy symbolism in it, and that's The Mask of Red Death. It's about a man named Prince Prospero, a very wealthy man who basically has a large manor and gets 1,000 of his best friends to live there with him to isolate them from a disease going around. So he decides to have himself a party. Party gets a little bit strange, gets a little bit dark. There's a bunch of rooms with different colors in it, I remember. And there's one final room that's the 7th room you're supposed to go through that's black with some red lighting. Anyway, a cloaked figure shows up. This is a costume party, I think, anyway. But a cloaked figure shows up and got everybody kind of freaked out. Midnight strikes, and Poe does a great job describing, the way that's going down. Anyway, so midnight strikes, and this Prince Prospero decides to confront this figure, and he ends up dying, right? And when others see what happened, I believe they come up to the cloaked figure, and it falls to the floor. It's empty, and everybody there dies of the disease. And the disease was bleeding out and stuff. Once again, it sounds like tuberculosis. Yeah, I think it was. I think EAP, Edgar Allan Poe, was talking about tuberculosis in this. But anyway, I thought it was one of the coolest stories he penned. I thought it was intriguing and interesting, and highly give it a read. I'd probably go Fall in the House of Usher first for me, Mask of Red Death second. Another one which is really good that I think does have symbolism too maybe in it, and it certainly has demons. When I say demons, I mean Edgar Allan Poe's own demons. That's the Black Cat, right? The main character's kind of a drunkard, right, and abusive. He ends up not liking his wife's cat. I think he ends up gouging an eye out. Sorry for the grossness of this, and for you animal lovers, it's a fictional story. And then he ends up hanging the cat, and then his wife gets mad, and they find another black cat. I think that's missing an eye, as I recall, but don't quote me on that. I haven't read the story for a while. But I remember the basics of it, because good stories, you remember the basics of them, right? And I think the new cat had a white chest that would change colors, etc., and sort of conform to shape, the white patch on its chest. Anyway, it's a pretty cool story, and so he ends up in a drunken stupor, killing his wife, putting her behind a wall. I believe it was a stone wall, so he was doing masonry type work. A couple weeks later, the detectives come. Where's your wife? Oh, she's gone. We don't know where she went. And they hear the yowling of the cat, who I think is actually inside the chamber with his deceased wife. And they knock a hole in the wall or whatever and find the wife, etc. So, real good. I think the demons he's talking about here, I think those two demons are, number one, I think it's alcoholism, which Poe fought most of his life. Number two, I would have to say it's insanity. Two things that Poe was keenly aware of that clearly the figure in this story exhibited. So I think that was Poe's wrestling match sort of with those issues in the Black Cat. Speaking of holding up somebody behind a chamber wall, let's talk about Cast of Amontillado. It tells the story of a man named Montresor who gets his buddy Fortunato drunk. They're walking around an estate somewhere or a castle anyway or something, gets him in the basement and puts another wall over him. But the problem is Fortunato, which is a horrible name for this person, who's had too much wine, is chained up. So he basically gets bricked in by Montresor. And as Montresor's getting ready to slide the last block into place, Fortunato, I think, says, "For the love of God, Montresor." And Montresor says, "Yes, for the love of God." And the block goes in. That's the end of it. And I think that a lot of people say it's Poe's disdain of alcoholism is why Fortunato gets chained up when he gets drunk and that happens to him. I don't see that even necessarily anywhere in the story. It could be just as easy Montresor's just a bad, evil person and decided he wanted to do something awful. It could be that too. Another short story that I loved was The Telltale Heart. Once again, deals with insanity. The main character is terrified or bothered or annoyed or whatever by the eye of this old man he's stalking, thinking of a way to kill him, and he opens the door at night and a ray of light shines on the guy's eye and he freaks out, kills the guy, puts him in the floorboards. Same story, cop comes, and I think he finally admits to doing it. But the problem is the cool thing about this story is that Poe does discuss the beating of the guy's heart and how the eyes bother him. Does a really good job of describing that. And so you really get a flavor for The Telltale Heart. I think that was the first one I read from Poe, and I think I probably stayed up for like a week straight. I was probably 9 or 10. That's not a real enlightening story to have, uplifting story to have, guy grab an old person and kill him, put him under the floorboards, right? Anyway, Poe wrote a bunch of other stuff people don't even realize. Murders of Rue Morgue is a detective mystery. Many people say it was one of the first of its kind, and he's the father of the detective mystery. It has to do with the orangutan that's killing people. Goldbug is one of my favorite stories by Poe. It's not horror at all. It's an adventure story. I think Goldbug was a well-written, fun story. But, of course, Poe is most known for his poem, The Raven. Right? Once Upon a Midnight Jury. I think every kid in high school should have to memorize some of The Raven. It's such a oddly cool poem and has a cool rhythm to it. It's a classic. Today when you see ravens, when you think of ravens, you might think of Poe and that poem. It is truly one of the best known poems in American history. And it certainly has aged well. You still see Poe's still a big seller. I mean, you see Poe shirts around once in a while. You see Poe's on mugs, Edgar Allan Poe's portrait and stuff. And The Raven. Poe has lasted a long time. So kudos to him for hanging in there, because he's lasted a long time. Of course, he wrote another poem that he died before he actually got to see published called Anabell Lee. Tells a story of a guy that lost his lover, and it was because the angels and God, I think, were jealous of their love, so he ended up sleeping with her in a tomb by the sea. Anyway, it's kind of a cool little poem, Anabell Lee. Anyway, feel free to look up Edgar Allan Poe's history. There's tons of it out there on the net. He's such a widely known and read author. I think that while Stephen King defines the horror genre, I can honestly say that I think Poe was the first to write a very disturbing story. There's been other ones too, of course, but Poe's stories were very well done and very eerie and very creepy, and written in a very readable way for 1840s English. Okay, so I strongly recommend giving them a run. You can lump Lovecraft in. There's another one that probably had an impact on today's horror mystery type writers, but man, Edgar Allan Poe, he had it going on. So unfortunately, he died in the streets in somebody else's clothes, I believe. His life didn't end well for such a immeasurable talent. I mean, he really was one of a kind, and I hope you take the time to read a couple of these. They're short stories. Start with Usher, then go to Mask of Red Death, 1 and 2 for me. If you don't like animals, stay away from if you like animals, stay away from the black cat. That's awful. But once again, I'm glad that I had a chance to talk about that, because Poe certainly was one of my, influences in early reading. So, well, that covers it for this episode. I'll be doing more episodes pretty soon. Not such a long break this time. I hope you enjoyed this. My next one is probably going to be on ghosts in literature. So, stay tuned for that. This is Noel Wing with Horror by the Book with Noel Wing. I'm out.